For the majority of its existence, the Need for Speed franchise has been a yearly mass market arcade racer aimed at people with only a passing interest in cars or racing. Yet in the early 2010s, stagnation and shifting market trends resulted in EA completely deviating from this formula. If Need for Speed were a rock band, Shift and Shift 2 Unleashed were its concept albums, bringing in outside help to write a radically different album that sounded unlike anything the band had ever produced before, and having the entire piece centered around one core theme. Unlike most concept albums, however, the Shift games were both great, they were just super divisive. Like most rock bands who create a concept album, fans are usually left wondering why such a drastic change was even warranted in the first place. Why not just make a straightforward rock album that capitalizes on what the group does best? The more you examine the releases leading up to Shift and the market trends at the time, the more sense it actually makes. EA was having trouble with Need for Speed in the years leading up to Shift. Carbon was seen as a rehash of Most Wanted. Pro Street was seen as this weird hodgepodge of street racing culture mixed with traditional track racing mechanics and kind of came off to the average person as an imitation of Forza Motorsport 2. A year later, Black Box tried their hand at a narrative driven game with Undercover, but by then the open world narrative driven driving game had already run its course. It also didn't help that the game wasn't very good. At this point, EA was open to pretty much anything for NFS 2009, and with the heights Forza and Gran Turismo were ascending to, EA was interested in having their own variant. It was basically seen as an investment into the JRPG-style car collecting genre. Nowadays, an off-brand variant of Forza or Gran Turismo doesn't sound very enticing, but in 2009 things were actually quite different, and this game was really important. Gran Turismo 4 was 4 years old, and Gran Turismo 5 was still yet to be released on the PS3, suffering numerous delays. Forza Motorsport was at the time an Xbox 360 exclusive, and the series was already becoming crippled with microtransactions and just poor, grindy, casualized game design. The PS3 was essentially still waiting on a Gran Turismo game that was supposed to have already come out, and the PC didn't have a GT-style game to begin with. Shift filled several enormous gaps on the market. At the same time, an interesting fad was occurring within the world of sim racing. By 2006 or 2007, more and more developers and modders began creating purpose-built street cars, kind of as a diversion to the normal array of amateur and pro race cars you'd see in the average racing sim. It's difficult for me to pinpoint when this fad started exactly, so bear with me here. But I think it started with ISI bundling a bunch of both licensed and unlicensed street cars within the original R Factor. The most notable, I think, being the Panos Esperante, and then a bunch of expansion packs were released for Race 07 that add street legal muscle cars and supercars. People generally thought these were great additions to each respective game and a lot of fun to dick around with, and Shift kind of expanded on this idea tenfold right as it started to pick up traction within the sim racing hobby. Race cars would obviously still be included in Shift, but they'd be restricted to end-of-game content as a way to showcase just how different a stock or mod streetcar was to something that was built for, say, FIA GT1 spec competition. Lastly, EA handed development of the Shift series to racing sim specialist Slightly Mad Studios, rather than building the game in-house with their current flock of developers. This was seen as a massive win for the sim racing community since it was the first major instance of a dev within the sim racing scene, making a game so successful and so critically acclaimed as they'd done with GTR2 a few years earlier that they were now on the radar of a AAA publisher. Even though EA was kind of already establishing themselves as a company that would cut corners and be pretty shady behind the scenes, this was a really big deal. It was like seeing a local hockey phenom finally get drafted into the big leagues. Shift and Shift 2 are generally pretty average games on paper. In vanilla versions of each game, the cars all kind of exhibit this weird floatiness akin to playing Grand Prix Legends and Fast Forward, and there's a nasty physics bug in the first game where the car bounces across the track if you put the suspension or shocks under too much load. Input lag is prevalent on a gamepad, and on PC, it's generally understood you need to make use of a community patch or two among other interesting hotfixes or additions. This really isn't why people held Shift and Shift 2 Unleashed in such high regard, though. Like the 2016 reboot of Doom, which unintentionally made a superstar out of Mick Gordon, the game is instead a vehicle for Dr. Stephen Baisted's excellent sound design to work in tandem with other exaggerated visual effects, creating a racing game that simulates the insanity and high-stress atmosphere of professional racing. Both Shift games feature a very dark, muted set of menus and kind of pile on the visual effects to a pretty nauseating degree. The cockpit camera shakes around and has an excessive level of both motion blur and depth of field applied. Dirt or bits of rubber constantly get smeared on the windshield, and racing at night is cranked up to horror movie levels of contrast. You generally can't see outside the area that your headlights are projecting on. In any other racing game, this would be seen as pretty overkill or just a developer tryharding in the graphics department, but Baisted's sound design helps complete this package. Engine notes are given an exaggerated snarl, power sliding occasionally overpowers the engine, and mini explosions go off anytime the player scrubs the wall. Once you get further into career mode and start running stuff with a V8 power plant in nighttime conditions, the game is just complete sensory overload of being thrown around the cockpit, shit hitting the windshield, and the engine note destroying your eardrums. And when the race is over, you're actually treated these like really subdued orchestral remixes of modern rock songs that sort of linger in the air as you cruise through the menus. It's almost like the game itself knows how crazy the sensory overload of the previous race was, and it's giving you a breather while you install upgrades or make setup adjustments. It's a fucking ride, and in a lot of cases, it's more than enough to offset the driving physics and some of the weird shit that can happen during races, not to mention the generally mundane game design. There weren't as many cars compared to Forza. Events were pretty run-of-the-mill sprint races with a few endurance races later in career, and the AI could just be all over the place. Now, yes, it was a car collecting game on the PC, and yes, it filled a huge gap for those still patiently awaiting GT5 or those who felt Forza was starting to lose its way, but the core problem with the Shift games is that this wasn't what a lot of people wanted. As mentioned at the start of the video, NFS games were by and large arcade racers, and a lot of people found themselves in way over their heads playing Shift. The driving model was just way too punishing for their skill level. When you watch footage of GT or Forza in action, the cars are pretty docile and drive more like hovercrafts where only major bumps or curbs unsettle the cars. By comparison, Shift remained a bit too realistic in this department, on top of some of the physics issues such as cars having their fuel tank located outside the car, massively offsetting their balance, and it caught way too many people off guard. PC sim racers hoping for a big budget sequel to GTR2 never really had their needs met either. Pit stops and fuel consumption were removed, and career mode borrowed a little too much from Forza, with most races being in the window of 3 to 5 laps, and the FIA GT1 and GT3 stuff being restricted to end of game content. DLC was released to reel in fans of GT Legends and sportsman level drag racing, and I think on the 360 there was like a Ferrari pack as well. But both sets of add on content still had the core issue of just being too shallow for the hardcore and too difficult to drive for the uninitiated. As a result, for every person who played the Shift series and really bought into the atmospheric experience the game was trying to sell them, there was another person looking past the excellent sound design and visual effects and feeling like the rest of the game just wasn't for them. However, there exists a group of people who were immensely satisfied with the Shift games. The reality is that sim racing as a hobby can be extremely dull and time consuming for people who just aren't super passionate about it. The Shift series essentially gave people a way to experience the absolute best parts of sim racing, such as learning a track, driving a car with realistic behavior, and experiencing the sensory overload that comes with being a race car driver without having to obsessively download R Factor mods or put up with clunky, visually dated games. That's basically who the Shift series was for, and on those merits, it 100% succeeded.